Hello, everyone. So today we wanted to talk for you as liaisons. What are some best practices to build relationships with your student host family and the importance of getting off to a good start and why it's so important? So in the beginning, you as a liaison, you get the notification, you're assigned to your student and your host family. So what do you do with that information? Generally, we would say that you want to already introduce yourself very early on with your host family, even before the student arrives, and kind of just establish yourself as, hey, I'm that person that will be not just doing monthly contacts, but kind of just here to help. I'm like a third party. I'm the person to run things by, to check on, if you have any questions, really talk to me. But establishing your role earlier on is great because that will also then make it less awkward if you come into a situation a month later and kind of say, oh yeah, by the way, I know that you and your student have been having this relationship, but I'm also here. The earlier that you can establish yourself as part of the AFS support package, essentially, the better off you're going to be and the more streamlined and seamless everything seems, right? Instead of it being forced, it feels a lot more organic and natural. Same thing to do when your student arrives on program. Really establish yourself, make sure that they know who you are and what your role is in their experience here in the US. They understand that you're kind of that person to talk about challenges with, or maybe talk about victories with, or just share the experience with, to bounce ideas off of, or brainstorm strategies, or talk through challenges, whatever that might look like. You're that individual. So the earlier that you can establish your role and what that means for your relationship with both the host family and student, the better off you will be and the more easier you will be able to manage situations that come up if they do come up. One thing that we always say is that if, and again, living in times of COVID, if in-person engagement is either uncomfortable or just is not as easily manageable, really consider other alternatives, like for instance, FaceTime, ways in which that you can express your emotion, the person can see your facial emotion, for instance. It really helps in building trust. And the more that you're able to achieve and realize trust with your student and host family, the more easier that they feel to share information with you that might be, sensitive, or that they might, want to be delicate with sharing. So these are just general best practices to consider. And again, ask open-end questions. If you ask just yes/no questions, yeah, maybe you'll get an answer, but you might not open up a dialogue, right? And this is a big piece of that. You want to open up dialogue as liaisons. You want to understand what the nitty-gritty is. So questions like, what surprised you so far? That can really help unpack and unlock some things that might be brewing that the host family or student just felt like the opportunity didn't present itself for them to share those kind of things. So this is how you as a liaison kind of intentionally bring that to the surface. These are strategies that you can use. And of course, if you are at a loss of what do I talk about with my student or host family? I don't know how to start the conversation. There are resources that AFS has available to you. So if you look on Help and Learning, there are monthly learning reflections that are very topic focused. So for instance, in the early months, it might talk about making friends at school, or how the general adjustments going for the host family with the student in the home. And then also work with the questionnaires that we have. We have a host family participant questionnaire. We have a cultural exploration questionnaire. These are amazing resources and really kind of give you a guide on what you could potentially talk about with your student and or host family. So a big piece of what we do is the intercultural learning experience. And of course, a lot of times, and as a liaison, you might be receiving a comment of a judgment that's being made on a student, and it might be characterized as behavioral. In other words, you might hear something like, oh, the student's quite rude, or the student just doesn't seem to really understand what I'm talking about. But if you're hearing kind of judgments based on these things, explore that and ask questions to engage your audience and kind of say, so why do you think that's rude? So for instance, things to look out for with direct cultures, we find that generally if we hear, oh, the student is from a direct culture, so generally Northern European culture, and we're hearing, oh, the student is rude, and it's like, oh, why? Oh, because they're really direct. They don't really, if I ask them a question, they just say no. And I'm like, okay, well, why are you being so harsh with me? But that is the way that that person might communicate and expect others to communicate. So they might not see it as any issue whatsoever. But of course, when the nature of a situation is cultural, and it's being interpreted as behavioral, that is a concern. And if that is not addressed and that knowledge isn't imparted onto the student and or host family, over time, it will be completely accepted as a behavioral issue and not a cultural issue. So this is why it's important and things to look out for. Look out for if you're hearing, yeah, they don't really have a filter, or like, oh, they speak their minds and no problem, or they just say what they're feeling. That could be very cultural. And it just maybe takes a little cultural re-education and just saying, hey, we can acknowledge that this is the way that one might culturally communicate, and then help them understand effective cultural communication in the US context. And also, we know the way that one might effectively communicate in the Northeast of the US might be very different than like what the Southwest looks like, or the South. So this is also very region specific in the US. And like, so you as a liaison and as a cultural informant are there to help kind of, parse that out a little bit and provide that knowledge. All right, so indirect communicators or indirect culture. So generally speaking, that is anyone that isn't kind of like, say, like Northern European or American. Many other cultures are more indirect. In other words, we read between the lines, right? You infer what you're saying. So instead of saying, for instance, the same kind of situation that was just presented, like, are you going to go to the movies? And the answer is no. A direct communicator would say no. Maybe a indirect communicator might say something along the lines of, all my friends are going to go to the movies tonight. In other words, can you please take me to the movies? But they're not going to say that because they want to give you the opportunity to say, oh, should I take you to the movies? So this is how indirect communication can work. And interpretations of indirect communication can be received as the student isn't honest, they're deceitful, they don't say what they feel, I don't know what they're feeling, they're not really respectful, they're sneaky. So if you're hearing these kind of assessments as a liaison for someone that's hosting someone from an indirect culture, then I think it's a good kind of signal to say, maybe the situation here is cultural and not behavioral, and work to ask those questions. So what is it exactly why do you think that person is not showing you respect? Or why is it that you feel that person is sneaky or not taking initiative or not saying what they mean? What ideas do you have about that? Ask those questions. It's really important. And these are kind of things like of how we help, not assume negative intention. It's really bad to assume negative intention. Everyone is here with, we would hope, the intention to be successful and do well, right? Our host families are hosting for good intentions. Our students are on program for good intentions. So if there are issues, be curious about them, rather than put an immediate value judgment on it and say, this is bad. Why did the kid come here? All these, whatever that might look like, that's not going to help you push yourself towards resolution. So ask clarifying questions. Be curious as to why these things are happening. Slow down the brain process of being like, I see this and this is what it means. When you're dealing with different cultures, there's going to be a lot of differences, and that's great. But you need to make sure that you're an agent in that learning. So maybe asking questions like, hey, I noticed that when I'm talking to you, you don't make eye contact with me. And in my culture, that kind of reads as disrespectful. Is that what you mean? And, asking those questions can be so helpful. And it might seem trivial, but really it's not. And of course, for more indirect communicators, verbally communicating can be really confrontational. So you're going to have to continue to think outside of the box. Maybe that means writing down your answers or expressing to me through other means, maybe art, photography, dream boarding, magazine clippings, whatever it might look like. Be creative in your approach. That's the beauty of support in dealing with different cultures. That it takes really no shape and size. It takes all shapes and sizes, right? There's no one size fits all. So be creative in your process, but be curious and lead with a learning-based approach. And again, the more that we can communicate and establish ourselves as the point of contact and use the resources that are available to us, the better off we're going to be. More proactive support is better support. So we really encourage you to do that and talk with your volunteer leaders about ways in which you can be proactive and what some best practices are that your team is using to make sure that those relationships are meaningful and they don't kind of take a turn or, dive into a negative space. Really use the resources available to you both locally and also on Help and Learning and otherwise. So again, thank you so much. Hope this has been helpful.